America has become a melting pot of ethnicities. Diversity is no longer a strange concept, but an accepted factor of life for many young Americans. As technology advances, our knowledge base grows along with our rapidly changing society. If knowledge is power, then mankind has more power than ever before. The problem is that we are ignorant of this power because of the sheer size of Earth and its inhabitants. Let's be honest, it's daunting. How can one person make a difference if there are over 7 billion other people that could do the same, if not better? Is it even worth it when there are so many other people? This ideology will do no good for anyone, so let's ignore it. One spark is all that's needed to start a fire, but that one spark may start a fire that doesn't want to be put out. At this point, you may be asking yourself what it is I'm rambling on about and why exactly it's important. To be completely honest, it is what you want it to be. But if you want something changed, you need to put one foot forward and believe in the power of an individual. Passion is what makes us fight for something and gives us the spark of life. Religion is something that countless people are passionate for. I have never been a person of religion, although I do respect the many forms it has to offer and the life values it teaches, but I have always found a peculiar interest in Buddhism, primarily because of its beliefs and goals. Buddhism is based on achieving inner happiness, known as nirvana, and being a good person, which I personally think should be everyone's goal. It was until this past summer when my world was flipped upside down. The ignorance I had that I was completely unaware of vanished, and I discovered why Buddhist symbolism and beliefs have spread into Western culture. Even in my high school, I see students wearing shirts that display Buddha, the Om symbol, or even mudra, the hand symbols of the Buddhist religion. I have appreciated Buddhist philosophy and way of life for as long as I can remember, but it wasn't until this past summer when I learned of the problems that surfaced over 6 decades ago that are still a major issue today. To be simply put, this religion has spread internationally out of its isolation because it had no other choice to if it wanted to survive. One of the main branches of Buddhism is known as Vajrayana and originated from Tibet, a small country in Asia that is in between India and China. Tibet was a sovereign nation that is isolated by the Himalayan mountains that also had its own unique language, monetary system, culture, and customs for centuries. It is now located on the globe politically under Chinese rule. Sadly, this was not as simple as I may make it seem. In 1950, Tibet was invaded by thousands of armed Chinese soldiers and could hardly put up a fight. Later in 1951, Tibet was forced to sign a 17-point agreement with the Chinese government that promised freedoms to the Tibetan culture and lied about promises of new schools, hospitals, and roads. More than 6,000 sacred monasteries were then destroyed, and the practice or even talk of Buddhism became extremely forbidden and punishable by extreme interrogation, torture, and even death. Between 1949 and 1979, it was reported that over 1.2 million Tibetans were killed. After the initial invasion, over 100,000 Tibetans fled to receive asylum in India. Tibet was an isolated culture due to the Himalayas, the world's third longest chain of mountains, and was known to be conservative because of this. The culture was nomadic and lived a very peaceful life without the use of various technologies we have here in America. After the initial invasion, Tibet faced widespread famine and growing inflation as the pressure of supporting the growing Chinese presence took its toll on the economy. Hundreds of thousands of Tibetans have escaped, and almost all of them had to cross through the Himalayan mountains. Sometimes refugees had no choice but to walk the frozen mountain caps in their bare feet with little to no food on a journey that was reported to take over 150 days by foot. Traveling by vehicle was extremely dangerous because of the numerous roadside checks. Because of this, only a handful of refugees have been able to take the journey completely by vehicle, a trip that would only take 4 days. For those who travel by foot, many end up suffering from extreme frostbite and rotting nails, and because there are no hospitals for Tibetans to receive immediate help from, they usually have to amputate their feet. When learning about everything that has happened in the past, I wondered what life is like for Tibet in the modern day. In a documentary known as Dispatches, Undercover in Tibet, I learned that conditions in modern-day Tibet are just as bad, if not worse, as they used to be. Tash Despa was a refugee that left Tibet 17 years prior to 2008. His goal was to sneak back into Tibet and stay there for 3 months. This was an extremely dangerous task, but would provide footage of what Tibet is really like. Despa made it extremely clear that just being in Tibet, he risks imprisonment, torture, and many other horrors the public would never know about. As he crossed the Himalayas, Despa recalled seeing many frozen corpses lying on the side of the road. One thing he said truly stuck with me and showed just how valiant one individual can be. When he was asked why he did this, he said, "It's worth taking the risk because without taking the risk, nobody knows what is happening in Tibet. The Chinese government has a political and social blanket that covers Tibet and hides it from the rest of the world. To ensure this, there's an extremely large amount of military activity within Tibet. In China, it is estimated that there is one soldier for every 1,400 citizens. In Tibet, it is estimated that there is one Chinese soldier for every 20 citizens. These soldiers keep constant watch over Tibet and made filming extremely difficult for Despa and his team. Human rights activists reported any Tibetans who challenged authority may be subject to detention, torture in custody, and other illegal abuses. The Chinese government is not afraid to abuse their power and has proven to do so many times in the past. Eventually, Despa and his team found a monk that was willing to speak on camera if his voice and image were completely distorted. The monk had to be extremely careful while meeting up for the interview because torture is still a widespread practice inside Tibet that included beating with sticks, electric shock batons, hooding, and sleep deprivation. Tibetans were being treated like animals, and in response, China said these accusations did not conform with reality and claimed that the government has made effective efforts to prevent torturing. There was one more interviewee that Despa got a chance to talk to. It was a woman that had undergone forced sterilization. She said that the Chinese government is trying to control the population of Tibet, which is already minuscule in comparison to the Chinese population. The woman said she had one child out of quota and was forced to either pay a fine she would never be able to afford or be sterilized. You could hear how deeply ingrained her terror was. She trembled every time she spoke. In 2002, a UN reporter said, women in Tibet are subjected to forced abortion, forced sterilization, coercive birth control policies, and the monitoring of menstrual cycles. They are given absolutely no privacy even when concerning the most personal matters that the government has no business knowing about. Even during mass groupings and religious ceremonies with monks, countless soldiers are present to watch over and film the monks even when they are praying. In one religious protest, soldiers opened fire on a group, killing 22 people. The Chinese claimed that the rioters killed the protesters, even though they had bullet wounds in their chests. The country was then put on lockdown and little information was ever released. A group of journalists went to Lhasa to report on the situation and were swarmed by a large group of monks, many of whom were on their knees crying and begging, screaming that Tibet was in fact not free. When asked about this, the Chinese embassy in London said, "The embassy has not been given sufficient time to investigate these allegations, but this program is not serious and not objective, and as a result not worthy of comment. They are choosing to ignore what is happening, and we're letting them do that." This summer, I traveled with the People-to-People Ambassador program to various locations around the foothills of the Himalayas. During our stay in Dharamshala, we were given the opportunity to listen to a High Lama and ex-political prisoner named Venerable Bagdro. Bagdro told my group about his experience growing up in Tibet and about his book, A Hell on Earth, which is used to describe his time in prison and his pilgrimage after. Bagdro and 5 other monks were arrested for leading a major religious demonstration that ended with a Chinese policeman being killed. During the court hearing, eyewitnesses report that the judges knew that Bagdro and his peers had been tortured for 2 weeks prior in order to get a confession. One monk received the death penalty after withdrawing his confession even though there was almost no evidence against him. Another monk received a life sentence and became paralyzed from the waist down due to the vigorous beatings. Bagdro was said to receive the least extreme torturing. Once being put into custody, he was tortured for 11 days straight with cattle prods, electric batons, and self-tightening handcuffs, and methods as extreme as waterboarding and aerial suspension from the arms. Bagdro said that after his 11 days of torture, there was 5 days of intense questioning and then 2 weeks of sporadic beatings. After a month of constant torture, malnourishment, and beatings, Bagdro wrote and signed a confession admitting his involvement with the crime. By this time, the self-tightening handcuffs wore his wrists to the point that bone was visible. After serving his sentence, Bagdro was told he must escape to India and tell his story to the exiled Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Buddhist religion. Bagdro knew that this must be done and had to leave his family behind without telling them anything to keep them from being hurt. He has not seen them since then. If nothing is done about this, Tibetan history and way of life will be altered far more than it already has been. Since 2009, there have been over 100 cases of self-immolation in public, a sacrificial practice that is believed by some to be the strongest way of raising awareness. At first, Chinese school systems offered to pay children to attend their school. Eventually, a policy was enacted that forced children to kill insects and birds to steer them away from Buddhism. If the children bypassed their quota for the day, they were given a Chinese silver dollar. Not only are the older generations of Tibetans being affected, but the new generations are also being shaped by this plight. The Chinese have quit teaching Tibetan language in school, as well as much of its own history. The children are being raised in a setting that will corrupt their mindset and perception, steering them away from their own culture. The Dalai Lama recalled, the methods the Chinese used to intimidate the population were so abhorrent that they were almost beyond the capacity of my imagination. In order to prevent them from shouting out, "Long live the Dalai Lama," on the way to execution, they tore out their tongues with meat hooks. The Chinese are trying to create tension between the generations of Tibetans, which would make control and manipulation easier. While I was in Dharamshala this summer, I got to visit a school called the Tibetan Children's Village. This institute housed, fed, and clothed many young orphans of all ages that were forced from their home in Tibet. I met some of the kindest children I have ever been able to meet in my life that were full of energy and happiness in its purest form. This village is a way to give modern education to those that need it most and teach them about the rich culture that is trying so hard to stay alive. I will never forget the smiles that gleamed on those children's faces. My time spent in Dharamshala was the spark to the fire that's inside of me, and it's just a spark for the much bigger fire waiting to be ignited. This situation is terrifying, and it's even harder when you look at it from one individual's perspective. It seems impossible for one person to do something. That's what I thought. That's exactly what Venerable Bhadra thought, and that's exactly what he told us we would be thinking. He emphasized how telling just one person can change the course of Tibet's future for the better. We can't change the world in one day, but if we make a conscious effort to change what the world will be, the effects can be monumental. I'm not asking for a lot. You can go on and live your life like you normally would, and you probably wouldn't notice a difference. All I ask is that you remember what you've learned and be grateful for what you do have, even if it's just a glass of clean water. And remember that one little spark can lead to something much bigger than any of us ever imagined.